Sonara came up behind me. I didn't hear her cross the carpet, and her hand found my shoulder, then slid down my arm to my wrist, warm and deliberate. Something low in my sternum dropped like a stone through still water. Her mouth was at the back of my neck before I could turn around, and I gripped the edge of the desk with both hands because if I turned around, this would become something I could not revise, and I had already spent 3 years being very, very careful about that. The thesis draft under my left hand had her handwriting in the margins. 3 years of her handwriting, in that particular dark ink she reserved for work, she took seriously, and now her breath was against my throat, and I could not, turn around. If you want to hear uncensored Too Hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 6 hours earlier, I was fine. This is important context. 6 hours earlier, I was a competent adult woman with a thesis draft and a cup of lukewarm coffee and a very manageable relationship with the concept of professional boundaries. I had a system. The system had worked for 3 years, through 2 academic calendars as a teaching assistant in Sonara's survey course, through 1 semester of independent study that probably should not have been granted to someone with my particular problem, and now through the final stretch of a doctoral thesis I had chosen to write on the lyric essay tradition, in part because Sonara Voss was the only person in the department who understood why that was a serious subject. The system was, keep the door open. Not metaphorically, literally. Every office hours meeting, every thesis conference, every time I needed her signature on a form, or her opinion on a translation, or her handwriting in my margins, door open. It was not a rule anyone had stated. It was a rule I had made for myself on the 2nd week of my first year, sitting across from her in her office, with her reading my work in a silence so complete I could hear the fluorescent light buzz, and understanding with sudden crystalline clarity that I had placed myself in a situation that required infrastructure. The infrastructure had held. It was 9 o'clock on a Thursday in November, and the departmental library was empty except for me, and I was the only thing standing between my thesis chapter and the committee review it needed to survive tomorrow morning. And the building was making the particular sound buildings make when all the humans have left them. The HVAC sigh, the structural settling, the specific quality of silence that is not silence, but the absence of the particular noise people make just by existing in a space. I had a good lamp. I had the thesis draft spread across the research table in the faculty room. I'd been given access for the semester, faculty privilege extended to advanced candidates. One of Sonara's administrative decisions I'd been careful not to read as anything other than administrative. I had my own coffee, gone cold, in the blue ceramic mug I always brought because it held enough to get me through a long session, and I had 4 pages left to revise and approximately 3 hours before I would stop being able to see straight. The research room was small in the way that only old buildings managed, not cramped, but contained, like a space that knew its purpose. A single desk facing the wall of glass-fronted shelving where the department kept its first editions, significant acquisitions, things too valuable or fragile for the open stacks. An armchair, perpendicular to the desk, angled toward the window. A single window that looked out over the quad, which was empty now and blue-dark, the courtyard lights throwing amber pools on wet stone. The door had a lock, but it was the kind you engage from inside for private study sessions, and I had not engaged it because I had a system. And the system included leaving myself an exit. I had been alone for 2 hours when I heard her. Not her footsteps. Sonara moved across carpet with a silence that I had come to think of as characteristic, the same quality as everything else about her, a kind of contained precision that didn't announce itself. What I heard first was the sound of the faculty wing hallway door, the particular pressure seal thunk it made when someone came through from the office corridor. Then nothing. Then her voice from the doorway. You're still here. Not a question. Sonara did not ask questions she already knew the answers to. I turned in my chair, and she was standing in the doorframe with 2 cups, her own travel mug in one hand, and I registered with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief. A second cup from the departmental kitchen, the thick white ceramic that meant she'd gone to the trouble of making a fresh pot. She was in what I had come to think of as her late session configuration. The charcoal wool blazer from the morning's faculty meeting still on, but the collar of the black turtleneck visible above it, without the blazer buttoned, which meant she'd been working through something and hadn't stopped long enough to change or pack her bag. Her hair was still in the low, twisted bun she wore for anything that required her to be taken seriously, which was most things. She had a pen behind her ear, not the fountain pen, that one she kept in her inside blazer pocket like a tool, which it was, available only for manuscript work. The one behind her ear was a lesser instrument, a reading pen, the kind she used for administrative tasks. She crossed the room and set the second cup on the desk beside my draft without asking if I wanted it. "The committee review is tomorrow morning," I said, which was not a response to what she'd said, but was the thing my brain produced. "I'm aware." She looked at the draft. Not at me, at the draft, with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that interested her. She had a way of reading something in the room before she engaged with it directly. A visual intake that covered the whole before the parts. "You're still on the Sappho epigraph." She could read my marginal notes from 3 feet away. I had known this about her, and had still apparently not accounted for it. "The Greek variant," I said. "The Voigt edition uses a different lineation than what I've been working from, and I want to verify the translation is doing what I think it's doing before I commit it to the final draft." She was quiet for a moment. The HVAC hummed. Outside, the campus bell tower rang 9 o'clock in its slow, measured way, each note falling into the dark like something deliberate. "I have the 1885, she said. I looked at her. "The Wharton edition, behind glass, 3rd shelf." Her gaze moved to the locked case. "It has the Greek facing the translation. If you want to verify the lineation against the earliest English scholarly apparatus, it's the most useful resource in the building." The 1885 Sappho was one of the restricted items. I had held it once, at her invitation, during my first semester. She'd taken it from the case herself and placed it in my hands with the particular gravity she reserved for things she considered worth the wait. And I had understood I was being given access to something that didn't come to everyone, and I had been careful not to hold it too long or let my hands shake. "The case key is in your desk," I said. "Yes." She looked at me with those dark, deep-set eyes that had a quality of stillness like water in a place light didn't reach easily. "Do you want to verify the epigraph or not?" "Yes," I said. She went to her blazer pocket and produced the key ring. Not the pen, the keys. She crossed to the glass case and selected the right key without fumbling, the motion of someone who knew exactly which key did what without having to think about it. And the lock turned with a small, precise sound, and the glass door swung open on its brass hinges. What she did with the room when she entered it was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't experienced it. It wasn't that the room got smaller, it wasn't that kind of presence. It was more that the existing objects in the room became more visible, more specific, more themselves. Because there was now something in the space that was paying attention to everything with that quality of focused precision, and the objects responded to being perceived that accurately by becoming more real. The lamp threw the same light, the window held the same dark quad, but the draft on the desk and the coffee cups and the thesis notes and we were all more distinct than we'd been 60 seconds ago. She found the Wharton on the 3rd shelf without having to search. Her hands on the spine were practiced and unhurried. She worked the book free from its neighbors the way you work a book free when you've handled it before and you know how much pressure is required, easing the pages rather than pulling the cover. She turned with it and crossed back to where I was sitting and set it on the desk in front of me, open to the index. "Fragment 31, I said. "The comparative translation." She turned pages. Her hands were long-fingered and pale against the yellowed paper, and she found the fragment without marking her place first, which meant she knew where it was. She set the book open before me, and then she didn't move away. She was standing beside my chair, slightly behind my right shoulder, looking at the page. I was looking at the page. The text was there, the Greek in its close-set Victorian typeface on the left, the Wharton English on the right, and Sappho's fragment 31 doing what it had been doing for 2,500 years, which was describing with absolute precision the specific physiological experience of being in proximity to someone you should not want. It seemed like fate smiling upon me, not the Wharton, the situation. I reached for the book to angle it better under the lamp, and her hand came to the spine at the same moment. Not to take it, just to steady it, the reflex of someone who spent a significant portion of their professional life preventing old books from falling. Our hands met on the binding, my fingers along the pages, the outer edge of her hand against my knuckles, her palm warm through the cover. Neither of us moved. The book sat between us, open to fragment 31, and her hand was against my hand, and the warmth of it was clearer than it should have been. Like the difference in temperature was more than could be accounted for by the room. I could smell her, the cedar and cold linen scent she carried, close enough now that I could distinguish the base notes from the surface ones. Cedar and something that was not quite sandalwood and not quite stone. Something dry and certain. Her breathing changed. It was barely audible. The HVAC was still running. The building was still making its building sounds, and the change in her breath was not dramatic. but I had spent 2 years as her teaching assistant and 1 year as her thesis student, which meant I had spent 3 years in rooms with her while she was thinking, while she was reading, while she was waiting for a student to arrive at the point she'd been steering them toward. I knew the rhythm of her breathing in a professional context the way you know the rhythm of a clock in a room you've spent enough time in, not consciously but completely, so that when it changes, your body registers it before your mind does. Her breath was slower, and then it wasn't there for a moment, and then it came back, the smallest controlled exhale. Her thumb moved. It was so small. The edge of her thumb, the side closest to her index finger, the heel of it. It moved against the spine edge where my knuckle rested. One slow, deliberate motion from the base of my knuckle to the first joint. It was not how you studied a book. It was not even close to how you studied a book. And then it stopped, and her hand was still again, and I was staring at fragment 31 of Sappho in an 1885 Victorian translation, while my pulse became briefly the loudest thing in the room. She pulled her hand back. Not fast. That would have been an acknowledgement. Slowly, deliberately, and then she turned and walked toward the window. And I did not watch her go because I was being very careful not to watch her go, and the book sat open in front of me with the warmth of her touch still registering on the back of my hand with the precision of a fact I was going to have to figure out where to file. She did not leave the room. She stood at the window with her travel mug and looked at the dark quad, and I looked at the text, and the HVAC hummed, and we were both present in the same small space with the same locked glass case and the same lamp, and the increasing understanding that the door to the hallway was 15 feet away and neither of us was moving toward it. I made a note in the margin. My handwriting was not entirely steady. She came back to the desk after several minutes. I had been tracking the shape of her in my peripheral vision, the way you track something you're trying not to look at directly. She picked up my cold coffee, looked at it, set it aside, and pushed the fresh cup closer to me without comment. "Read the Greek," she said. I looked up. Fragment 31, read it aloud. She was standing slightly behind my right shoulder again, looking at the text. "The translation you're working from. I want to hear the lineation you've been using." My voice, when I found it, was not precisely the voice I used in seminars. It was lower, and it did not start on exactly the right note. But I read it, the Greek syllables of Sappho's fragment, the particular way the Voigt lineation broke the stanzas, and my voice in the quiet of the research room with the HVAC and the dark window and her behind my shoulder was an instrument I had very limited control over in this moment. I mispronounced the 5th line. "Phenete mai," she said from directly behind my right ear. The warmth of her breath arrived at the side of my neck before her voice did. That was the order of events. Warmth first, then sound, then the meaning of the sound. The Greek was correct, and the correction was professional, and her mouth was 3 inches from my ear, and I had been reading Sappho's precise physiological description of proximity as ruin for the last 4 minutes. "Phenete mai," I repeated. "Almost right." "The 2nd syllable," she said. And then she said it again herself, directly, leaning slightly forward so that I could hear the placement, and her hand came to the page, not the book, my draft, the page I'd been looking at. Her index finger coming to rest alongside my index finger on the margin, not on the text itself, but on the white space beside the Greek I'd transcribed in my notes, and she said, "Here," and the word had different weight than any monosyllable should have been able to carry. I stopped breathing. Not as a figure of speech. The air simply departed from the relevant anatomy. Her finger was alongside my finger on the margin of my thesis draft, which she had been reading for 3 years, which had her handwriting in the margins in that particular dark ink, and her breath was at my ear, and she said "here" in the voice she used for things she was certain about, which was most things, and I could feel my own pulse in the front of my throat. Her hand on the page trembled. It was so slight, a tremor that came and went in the space of half a breath, the kind of thing that could have been attributed to fatigue or cold, or any number of things that had nothing to do with the fact that her finger was alongside my finger on the page, and neither of us had moved. But I had been in rooms with her for 3 years. Her hands did not tremble. She held a pen with surgical stillness. She had once performed an entire guest lecture with a broken wrist she hadn't yet had x-rayed, because she didn't cancel lectures, and the orthopedist couldn't see her until Thursday. Her hand trembled, and then she made it stop. The making it stop was its own piece of information. She straightened, the warmth at my ear retreated. Her finger lifted from the page margin, and she stepped back. and I was left with the draft and the Sappho and the coffee and the particular quality of air in a room from which the pressure has not yet equalized, like a door just closed against a strong wind. I wrote the correction into my notes. My handwriting was not what it normally was. I noted this with the distant interest of someone observing a technical problem in a system she operated but did not entirely control. We worked for another 40 minutes like that. Her at the armchair with a journal article she'd produced from somewhere, me at the desk with the thesis draft and the 1885 Sappho, occasionally reading a line aloud to verify a translation choice, occasionally receiving a correction or a confirmation in return. It was, by any external measure, a graduate student working late with her thesis advisor, present for collegial reasons. By any external measure. What it was internally was the specific experience of existing in a room with something you have been refusing to look at directly for 3 years, and having that thing stand up, walk to the center of the room, and simply stay there in full light. My body knew what was happening in the room with me. My body had known since the first week of my first year, and had been conducting its various responses in a private register I'd gotten quite good at monitoring and managing. But the management required distance, and the distance required the open door, and the door was closed tonight. Not locked, but closed, the hallway dark on the other side of it. And the research room was 11 feet by 14 feet, and she was in it. I found the third error in my Greek transcription and corrected it. She turned a page. The campus bell tower rang 10 o'clock. I had 30 lines left to verify. "I've been wanting to ask you something," I said. The sentence came out of my mouth without having been fully vetted by the part of my brain responsible for the infrastructure. It arrived in the room and I could not take it back. She looked up from the journal. I turned in the chair to face her, and the angle brought us closer than the previous hour's arrangement had allowed, because she was in the armchair perpendicular to the desk, and I was turned in the desk chair, and the distance between us was suddenly 6 feet instead of 10. And it was going to become less than that because I was apparently going to stand up now, which I did. She watched me stand. She did not put the journal down. "I've been wanting to ask you something," I said again, because the first time I'd said it, I'd lost the end of the sentence, and I needed to see if saying the beginning again would produce it. It did not. She set the journal on the chair arm. Her gaze was on my face with that quality her attention had. A physical event with a specific location, a warmth that landed in the upper chest and stayed, that made you aware of the exact distance between you and the source of it. I took a step toward her, and then I stopped, because the armchair was between us, and stopping at the armchair was a reasonable thing to do. And I was still in favor of reasonable things, technically. "Don't," she said, not loudly. She did not raise her voice, because Sonara Voss did not need volume to make herself clear. The word arrived in the quiet of the room with the full weight of everything she was not saying, and I understood immediately that she was not telling me to stop asking. She was telling me she already knew the question, and she was asking me not to make her answer it. And the reason she was asking me not to make her answer it was because she already knew what the answer was. And the knowing was in her voice. It was unmistakable. "Don't," she said. And her voice was not controlled in the way it was controlled in lecture halls and faculty meetings. It was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the control itself is an enormous effort, and underneath it I could hear something that I had not heard in her voice in 3 years of proximity, which was the quality of want. I stopped at the armchair. We were 8 feet apart. The desk with the thesis draft was behind me, and the window with the dark quad was to her left, and the locked glass case was behind her left shoulder, and the door was to my right and 15 feet away, and I was not looking at it. She was still in the armchair, and she had set the journal down, and her hands were in her lap, with a stillness that was not natural stillness. It was the stillness of someone holding something still. Her jaw was tight. The angle of the lamplight caught the line of it, the defined architecture of her face, the dark eyes that were doing something I had not seen them do, which was not moving away from my face. She lifted her hand. It came up slowly. Her right hand, the one she used for the fountain pen, the one whose thumb had moved against the spine of the Sappho an hour ago in a motion that was not how you studied a book. It lifted from her lap and came up toward my face, and I did not move, because I could not have moved any more than I could have stopped the bell tower from marking the hour. Her hand rose until it was level with my face, and then it was 2 inches from my cheek, and it stopped. It stopped. Her fingers were slightly parted. Her palm faced me. The lamp was behind and to the right, and her hand was in the light, and I could see the slight tension across her knuckles, the controlled restraint in the tendons of her fingers, and I understood that this was not indecision. This was something much more precise than indecision. This was a question she was asking without words, because asking it with words would have been something she could retreat from, and she had constructed it in the only form that would not allow her to retreat, which was a physical suspension in the space between us that required an answer. From me, that could not be ambiguous. She was asking. She was asking with her hand 2 inches from my face in the amber lamplight at 10 o'clock on a Thursday in November, with my thesis draft on the desk behind me and the 1885 Sappho open to fragment 31 and 3 years of careful distance between us that had apparently been, for both of us, a form of architecture we'd been building against the same pressure from opposite sides. The 2 inches were the most present 2 inches of my existence. I could smell cedar and stone at that distance. I could hear the slight change in her breathing from the quality of it at the desk, slower and not fully even, as if the evenness was being produced by deliberate effort rather than arriving naturally. My own pulse was somewhere in my ears and my throat and the backs of my hands simultaneously. The lamplight was warm, and the room was very quiet except for the HVAC and the distant structural sound of a building at night, and her hand was 2 inches from my face, suspended, asking. Her fingers were not perfectly still. The slight tremor I'd felt in her hand on the page, the one she'd made stop. It was back, barely perceptible in the specific way that things you've suppressed return when the suppression becomes more expensive than the thing itself. A fine tremor in her fingertips, in the air 2 inches from my cheek, that her stillness could not fully cover. This was what it cost her to hold still. This was the information I had been missing for 3 years. Not whether she felt it, but what it cost her not to act on it. And the cost was visible now in the 2 inches of suspended air between her hand and my face, in the slight unsteadiness of fingers trained to precision, in the quality of her breathing. That was controlled because control was a practice she'd been engaged in, on this specific subject, for as long as I had. I closed the 2 inches. I turned my cheek into her palm. The contact arrived in the following order. Warmth, first, more than expected, more than the room's ambient temperature accounted for, as if her hand had been holding heat as carefully as it had been holding everything else. Then pressure, the slight cup of her fingers adjusting to my cheek, the pad of her thumb at the corner of my jaw, the heel of her hand against the hinge of it, a geometry that was not accidental, that held my face at a particular angle, a particular tilt, as if she had decided on this angle before her hand had left her lap. Then the specific sensation of her skin against mine, the slight roughness of a writer's hand where the pen sits, the cool smoothness of the back of her knuckles that I now understood, because I was inside the experience rather than outside it, and everything inside it was different from anything I had imagined in 3 years of not imagining it. Her thumb moved. The corner of my jaw, where it met the line of my chin, the pad of her thumb tracing that line with a deliberateness that could not be attributed to anything professional. A single slow motion that acknowledged exactly what this was. She stood. Not quickly. The motion was controlled, a decision made rather than a reflex. She unfolded from the armchair, and she was taller than me by the height that always reorganized something in my spatial awareness of her. And her hand was still on my jaw, and she was looking at me with those dark, still eyes, and the expression in them was an expression I had not seen there in 3 years, because it was not an expression she deployed in professional contexts. It was not controlled. Or rather, it was controlled, but barely. And the barely was showing. Her other hand came to my face. Both hands now, framing it, her thumbs at the angles of my jaw and her fingers spread into my hair at the temples. And she was holding my face the way you hold something you have wanted to hold for a long time and have been making very careful decisions not to hold. And the quality of her attention at this distance was so total I could feel it as a physical event in the center of my chest. A warmth that was nothing like the lamp and nothing like the room. She looked at me. 1 second, 2, the kind of time that does not move at normal speed. The lamplight was warm between us. The HVAC hummed. Outside, the quad was empty and blue dark. The thesis draft was on the desk. The 1885 Sappho was open to fragment 31, which described in precise ancient Greek the experience of watching someone you wanted, which was the thing I was currently living on the other side of. Looking up at Sinaravas, who was looking down at me with both her hands on my face and an expression she had stopped controlling. Her mouth came to mine, not soft, not hesitant, certain. Careful and certain, which was the most Sinara thing I could have experienced, the precision of it, the quality of decision behind it. As if she had been considering the exact angle and pressure long enough to have arrived at a conclusion. Her lips were warm, and her hands were warm, and the cedar and stone of her was very close, and this was nothing like professional, and it was 3 years of not this arriving all at once. My hands found her. I reached for her waist, my fingers meeting the open edge of the charcoal blazer and finding the black turtleneck beneath it, the ribbed knit warm and slightly giving under my hands, and I felt her inhale against my mouth. A sharp intake, not loud, but the sharpest sound she'd made all evening, the smallest loss of the composure that cost her so much to maintain. She kissed me, and the last 3 years did the thing that pressurized structures do when the load becomes more than the architecture can hold. Not a collapse, not a ruin, but a settling. Like a building that has been holding against something finally choosing to bear the weight instead. My hands tightened in the fabric at her ribs. She made a sound. Low, not quite a sound. A quality of breath. An exhale into the kiss that was not controlled, that came from somewhere that was not controlled, and I felt it against my lips and in my own chest simultaneously. Her other hand left my face. It went flat against the bookcase behind me, beside my head. Not pressing, not restraining, simply establishing. Here is the edge of the world. Here is the boundary of the space we are in. Her palm was against the shelving beside my temple, and her mouth was on mine, and I was between the bookcase and her body with the warmth of both. And the geometry of the research room had reorganized itself around 2 people who had spent 3 years, very deliberately, not organizing themselves this way. The kiss changed, slower, deeper, the careful certainty becoming something else, not less careful, but more present, more itself. My fingers curled in her turtleneck, feeling the warmth of her through the knit, and her hand on my face had moved to my hair now, fingers in the honey blonde waves, and I thought in the most distracted and distant part of my mind. I am going to think about this for the rest of my academic career, and that thought dissolved before it could fully form because she was kissing me with the focus she gave to things she considered worth the full weight of her attention. I had always wanted to be something she considered worth the full weight of her attention. Her hand at my hair slid to the back of my neck. Her fingertips at the nape, just at the hairline, a light pressure that nonetheless was the most specific thing I had felt all evening. Because the back of the neck is a place you can feel a breath before you feel a hand, and I had been feeling her breath there for 3 hours without meaning to, and now her hand was there, and my sweater had ridden up on one side. I became aware of this in the specific, concrete way you become aware of things that are actually happening to your body, ridden up where her hand had slid to the bare skin at my lower back. The warmth of her palm against the skin there, warmer than the room, warmer than anything. A temperature that arrived like information. I made a sound. I noted it distantly as it happened, the way you note something that is occurring in your body without your specific authorization, and it landed in the quiet room and she heard it, and I felt her pause. Not stop, but pause, a breath against my mouth. And in that breath, I heard the quality of her restraint doing something it had not done before, which was admitting that maintaining it was becoming genuinely difficult. She broke the kiss. Her forehead came to mine. The contact was its own thing, the press of her forehead to my forehead, skin to skin, her hands still in my hair and at my neck, and her breathing was audible in a way it had not been at 10 o'clock when she'd been reading the journal article in the armchair. She was breathing like she'd been running. Like the 3 hours of professional evening in the research room had been a long run that she had just completed. I could feel her breath on my mouth. The 2 inches between our lips were charged with the specific charge of things that have just happened and are deciding what to do next. Her hands were trembling, both of them against my neck and in my hair, a fine trembling she was not making stop this time. She had stopped making it stop. The fountain pen had fallen from the desk at some point in the last several minutes. I heard the clatter of it distantly, the way you hear things that are not the thing you're primarily occupied with, and neither of us moved to retrieve it. "Sonara," I said. The word came out in my voice and sounded like it had been waiting there for 3 years, which it had. Her thumbs moved, both of them, the ones at my temples, the ones in my hair. A small motion, not the motion of someone reasserting control, but the motion of someone acknowledging what they are holding. She tilted her forehead against mine, and her eyes were closed, and her breathing was settling by degrees, which was how Sonara Voss assembled herself. By degrees, by will, with the patience she brought to everything she cared about. She stepped back. not far, not out of reach. One step, which was enough to let air move between us, and I felt the loss of her warmth with a precision that was almost clinical. Exactly where on my lower back the skin cooled when her hand left it. Exactly how the front of my body registered the absence of hers. She was looking at me. Her blazer was open. The black turtleneck was pulled slightly to one side where my hands had been, a disruption in the composition that was not going to be easily smoothed. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression I had not seen before this evening, the one she was not bothering to disassemble. She bent and picked up the fountain pen. The motion was careful, deliberate, unhurried, the way she handled things she intended to be precise about. She straightened, looked at the pen in her hand, and then set it on the desk between us. In the center of the desk, equidistant from the thesis draft and the Sappho, set down with a particular placement that had a quality of intention to it, like a period at the end of something, she looked at the pen on the desk. She looked at the disruption in my sweater, the hem rucked up on one side where the skin of my lower back was visible in the lamplight, and her gaze on that specific disruption was a physical event in my chest. Then she looked at my face. "This doesn't happen again," she said, "until you've defended your thesis. Not, I can't. Not, we shouldn't. Not, this was a mistake. Until." My pulse was in my throat, and the lamp was warm, and the thesis draft was on the desk with 3 years of her handwriting in the margins, and she was standing 2 feet from me with the fountain pen she'd just placed between us like a marker, like a line, like a date on a calendar that was not yet here, but was coming. "When's my defense date?" I said. The silence lasted 2 seconds. 3. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something more careful than a smile, something that was a smile the way that a held breath is related to breathing, an acknowledgement with the lid still on it. It arrived in her face and was not permitted to go further, and that restrained, contained almost smile was somehow more than anything that had come before it, because I had not seen it before, in 3 years, and I was seeing it now. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. The HVAC hummed. The window showed the empty quad, amber lights on wet stone. The thesis draft was in front of me with her handwriting in it, all that careful distance compressed into margin notes that I now understood differently. The precision of her commentary, the places where she'd written a word twice in the same margin, the sections she'd returned to without being asked. I understood what her handwriting looked like when the distance was real. I was going to have to learn now what it looked like when the distance was constructed. She reached out. Her hand came toward my face, and I went still. The same stillness I'd held at the desk an hour ago, before the book, before her thumb on the spine edge, before all of it. And her fingers found a strand of honey blonde hair that had escaped across my cheek, and she tucked it behind my ear with a gentleness so specific and so complete that it was entirely unlike the precision of everything that had preceded it. A gesture that had no professional reading, a gesture that was simply what it was. Her hand lowered. She picked up her travel mug and her journal and the keyring to the glass case, all with the same deliberate efficiency, the motions of someone recollecting the ordinary instruments of their day, and she walked to the door. She paused at the threshold. She did not look back. 6 weeks, she said again, to the doorframe or to the dark hallway, and then she was through the door and I could hear her footsteps on the faculty corridor carpet. Not quite silent this time, or maybe I was listening differently now, and then the pressure seal thunk of the hallway door, and she was gone. I stood in the research room alone with the lamp and the thesis draft and the 1885 Sappho still open to fragment 31. The fountain pen was on the desk between where we had been. I sat down. I looked at the thesis draft with her handwriting in the margins. 3 years of her handwriting, all those careful notations in that particular dark ink she reserved for work she took seriously. The margin comments that went 2 lines when one would have done, the sections she'd marked to return to. I had been reading this handwriting for 3 years as a form of professional attention, as the evidence of a scholar engaging rigorously with a text she found worthwhile. I was going to read it differently now. I was going to read it knowing what her hands looked like when they were not controlled, what her breathing sounded like when it cost her something, what her face did when she stopped managing it. I was going to read her handwriting in my margins and know that the precision of it was also the precision of restraint, and that the restraint had been, for 3 years, the same kind of architecture I'd been building in the same direction from the other side. The thesis was due tomorrow. I had 30 lines of Sappho left to verify, and 6 weeks before, everything that had happened in this room tonight was allowed to happen again. On the other side of the last institutional reason either of us had to hold the distance. 6 weeks felt like a very precise kind of waiting. the kind that knows its own end date, the kind that is not technically waiting at all. It is anticipation, which is a different structure entirely, one that contains its own answer already built in. I picked up my pen, not the fountain pen, that was not mine to pick up, and I looked at the Sappho, and I read fragment 31 one more time from the beginning. It was, I decided, an extremely accurate poem.